The race is on, and Aston Martin dominated the headlines in the final part of the Barcelona test when its aggressive Adrian Newey creation broke cover, while Lewis Hamilton ended the 5 days of running with the fastest time for Ferrari. But does the Aston Martin speed match its looks, and is Mercedes really the team to worry about? I'm Edd Straw, and joining me to hit the big stories from testing are John Noble and Scott Mitchell-Malm. Right, Scott, let's get on with it with the car that caught everybody's attention when it finally rolled out of the garage on Thursday afternoon. The Aston Martin AMR 26. Has Adrian Newey played a blinder?
He certainly led the design of something very different. And if even half of the novel looking ideas on that car turn out to be enough of a step ahead of the conventional designs that we've seen, then yes, that could well be the class-leading car of 2026, because there's elements to it that I'm sure could be replicated if needed, but there are others that are clearly tied to major mechanical decisions like the front and the rear suspension and other things that presumably relate to the specific nature of the packaging of the Honda engine and the cooling requirements around it, where you see a very interesting engine bodywork shape, for example. That is just bodywork, so I imagine that won't be a make or break design choice, but things like the front suspension and where the rear suspension, where part of that is mounted, for example, not so easy to replicate that if that ends up being a small edge. But the big question is, does it actually work? Because it arrived so late in this test and ran so little in this test, we have no idea, even by testing standards, and this test standard in particular, how good that car is, because it didn't do any representative running.
Yeah, exactly. Just the 4 laps before it ground to a halt on Thursday, and then Alonso did 61 laps, did a 20.795. So we've not seen any indication of the pace of that car. But John, it's just very Adrian Newey, isn't it? Everything is pushed to the nth degree. You can see the front suspension geometry really optimized for aero advantage, and it's one of those things that when you look at it, you think, well, if it's not good as a car, it's not for want of trying, is it?
Yeah, I mean, within seconds of that car running out, we'd got sent some pictures of it, pretty good pictures of it, actually. And the first reaction was, wow. You just looked at it and there was so many elements of it that were fascinating. So it almost could only ever have been an Adrian Newey car, just because it looks so different. But part of me thinks, and you saw the trouble start to the test, and then for some reason Fernando's running a bit speed limited on the straights today. Is that an issue with the power unit? Is there some aero reason for it? Is it actually kind of a step too far? Is it too ambitious? And could this even be a repeat of, for example, the MP4 18? That famous McLaren, very aggressive design, brilliant concept, super quick, but actually never got to race because it was just so difficult to manage. So I think we'll want to see some progress from that car pretty quick. But I think it's also interesting that in a year where many teams have started out with basic packages, they want to understand the power unit, the regulations, the setup, everything. Aston's gone all in and seems to have bought the most aggressive package it can to the very first test.
What is really, really curious is whether or not Newey, being in the position that he's in as managing technical partner, so fully involved and invested, none of this Red Bull arguing over, how much does he care, how much work has he actually put into it, blah, blah, blah. But also team principal now as well. So he's got no one in the structure that can say no on any level to him. Is how much of that kind of completely uncaged Newey is just a full unleashing of quirky ideas, potential, and as you say, not for the lack of trying, coming up with a class-leading F1 car. And how much of it is, these are all great ideas in kind of principle or in the wind tunnel in your head, but how does it actually work in reality? And getting answers to that over the course of the season will be fascinating, assuming we get to see the car at its full potential. Because as I understand it at the moment, it's overweight, and not just by a couple of kilos. The Honda engine, all the information I've had from various sources is that Honda's not in optimal state for the start of the new engine rules. So you do run the risk of having a McLaren Honda-esque scenario, except for I probably have a bit more confidence that this Aston Martin or a Newey designed car would be better than what McLaren actually had versus what McLaren thought it had in the mid-2010s, or late 2010s rather. So I'm really curious to see kind of what the reality of it is. And to John's point about seeing those images for the first time in our reaction, I think my reaction was actually more, what the F is that? Because one of the first things I saw on the car was on the front suspension and the inboard mounting point of that wishbone rearward leg. And then you sort of see it and it's kind of like that. And it's just looks like part of the suspension is basically on its side, or certainly like it's collapsed at the rear because it's mounted so low. So you look at that and think, it's got Newey fingerprints all over it, obviously, but I think also probably shouldn't just call it a Newey car. I think it does a disservice to other people that will be feeding into it, especially someone like Enrico Cardillo, who's a senior technical figure there. But it's very much you can see it's a Newey Aston Martin versus its predecessors. And I'm not surprised that the suspension's interesting, because the suspension, especially the rear suspension, was something he was always credited with as being a massive factor of the start of that Red Bull dominance of the ground effect era. That's where Newey had his biggest influence, even though you maybe associate him as purely as an aero guy and all these crazy surfaces and mad packaging and stuff like that. He's obviously much, much more rounded as a designer, so I'm not surprised he's shown influence there.
It is a beautiful car, though. It looks mega.
Even in the carbon fiber black, it looks really, really good. It'll probably look even better once it's got the proper livery on it. But it's a good point you make about Newey, Scott, because I think one of his great strengths that we've seen during rule changes is he's very, very good at looking at a rule set and working out how to adjust all the dials of things you can do to get the best performance out of it. That's something he's extremely good at. You could say it's a holistic view of the car, which is massively important. Obviously, we don't know how quick it is. And if it's not quick, we then need to understand which elements of the package aren't quite there. But what is very clear is they were really up against it getting this car going. And I guess there's a little bit of that question of how mature is the team, John? Is it ready to operate at the level that it's trying to in terms of pushing everything through, designing everything to the nth degree? Because as we talked about, me and Scott talked about when we talked about Williams, there's an ideal way of doing everything, but you've also got to have your facility and everything you do up to that level to do it. So Newey will unquestionably have stretched everything in Aston Martin. So I guess that's the key. Is Newey just at the point where he's a little bit better than where this team has matured to? That could be at the heart of how well certainly the car side of things works.
Well, I think he's been pushing the organisation on quite a bit ever since he arrived. We remember that press conference in Monaco, Adrian's first appearance in front of the media. And his very first thing was saying, our simulation facilities aren't really up to scratch. We are quite a way behind. The correlation isn't good enough. We need to improve. So I think there is an element of, what Newey understands and believes a top team to be, what a top team is these days, the qualities that are needed, and where Aston Martin is. And I think everything points to, eventually all these ingredients are going to work and make a super strong team. What we don't know is the time frame. And is this rule set, where is Aston Martin going to fit on the kind of peaks of this rule set? Is it going to hit the ground running and make the most of uncertainty at the start? Or is this about building foundations going forwards, and it's about catch up with works teams potentially holding the early advantage and coming through? So I sense Aston Martin's not there yet in a position to head to Melbourne, win the race and be gunning for a championship. But I think the ingredients are there, foundations are there to get there. It's just a question of how long it's going to take.
But that's all part of why I think this could be the car that, even by the fact that every team, every car will be able to go faster than what we saw in Barcelona this week once it turns everything up. But I feel like this could be the car, probably should be the car that's currently furthest from its potential, because obviously, not just in lap time, obviously that was not a representative Fernando Alonso, Aston Martin, Honda lap, but just if that car had shown all that it was capable of on the day, I still think it would have been a reasonable chunk off, just because you look at it from the engine side, that weight side of things, and maybe also some elements of the car that will need to be optimized to get the most out of it. I just can't believe that car, when it runs, even in the first test in Bahrain, will be anywhere near sort of what what it could be capable of. They've got to figure it out. I mean, did you guys see the photos showing the rake of the car compared to like the McLaren and the Red Bull? Like it's got so much rake. Certainly, I mean, let's wait and see what they run in Bahrain, because you can always be a bit misled by the angles of photos. It certainly looks like it's got the most rake of any car, which is, that's not necessarily an indicator it's going to be the best or the worst car on the grid. But when it seems so visibly different as far as rate goes, because you're talking millimeters at the end of the day, it's something where if that works absolutely as intended straight away, brilliant. But if it's set up inherently differently to the others, is that going to take some time to find out where the sweet spot is and how to get the most out of it? So when you bring a car that looks so different and presumably behaves so different, I don't think it's then a leap to think that it might take a bit more figuring out, especially if it has all been as late as it looks. I can't imagine it was Aston's preference and Aston's partner's preference, even though this was a quote-unquote closed test with pictures going out and footage going out. I can't believe it was their preference to run an unbranded car. I think the car looks better for being in bare carbon, because the cars just look mean when they look like that. But it's been really intense. Alonso said the last couple of weeks to get everything together have been, it sounds quite mad at the factory. And knowing Newey and looking at what is on the car, it wouldn't surprise me if some of those decisions on some of those parts were actually taken quite late. And one of the reasons why the car looks the way it does is because maybe there was a change in the design fairly late. Maybe something was locked in fairly late. And then that means all of your testing around that is presumably not as advanced as what other teams will be doing, because the CFD and the wind tunnel work is all based around knowing what the car's going to look like. So if that whole design got set quite late, all of that stuff will have been compromised, and they won't be as far along the curve, basically, just across the board with the development of this car.
I think it's just a manifestation of what this whole situation with Aston Martin is. A manifestation of what you get with Newey, isn't it? He pushes everything. He's uncompromising. He's super competitive. It's not about, let's look at what we've done and got. It's good. It's not about making excuses for not being there. It's like, right, we've got to improve this. We've got to improve this. We've got to do this. We've got to do this. And that is certainly going to pay off for Aston Martin. Whether it's with this car, we'll have to wait and see. But John, Ferrari set the pace, quite low profile before that point for Ferrari. Then Lewis Hamilton banged in that fastest time late on. Times don't mean a great deal, but are there reasons for the Tifosi to get their hopes up?
I think so. Compared to last year, it would have been difficult to have a worse season than 2025 compared to expectations. The team's thrown everything at this 26 car. It's come out the blocks in a way I think it will be quite happy with. The reliability has been there from a start. Lewis has talked about a team that's on it, that the debriefs are working well, the communication's improved, they've made some changes, the car seems to be working. And I think perhaps the best news of all is that Lewis also seems happy in this generation of cars. He's talked about them sliding a bit more, snapping, being fun to drive, great to catch, enjoyable. There's an enthusiasm behind Lewis now that we haven't seen probably since the Chinese Grand Prix last year. We had all that positivity the start of last season. Not too bad a start. Australia in the wet was a disappointing weekend, but he won the sprint race in China. Everything looked great, and then the season kind of tailed away from there. And although lap times, ultimately count for little, because you can pump all the fuel out, you can put soft tyres on, you can top a test if you want to. Generally, these days, teams do similar things. They're running through similar programs. So I think to end the test with the mileage they did, with a lap time that was in the ballpark of Mercedes, I think is encouraging. But I don't think you'll find anyone who doesn't think Mercedes are right now the pre-season favourites.
Yeah, exactly. And even though Mercedes was only second quickest overall, that's only second quickest. That's still pretty good. And also the times don't really matter. It does feel ominous, doesn't it? Scott, you wrote a story that ran on the race website that ran in the middle of the final day all about how ominous they were. So would you declare Mercedes to be the winner of this test?
Insofar as it is the real early benchmark, yeah, I think that's fair to say. I described in the piece we always do at the end of a test and video as well, that everything we learned. I described Ferrari as the sleeper hit of testing, because Ferrari was genuinely sort of putting together a decent week, but it wasn't looking like it would end the week on top, or as the team that would naturally get those kind of headline grabbing results, lap times, whatever, and the plaudits of, a Ferrari actually, whisper it quietly, but a Ferrari the favourites, or anything like that. And then boom, they're right there, pump that lap time in right at the very end, go to the very top, and all of a sudden that test goes from quietly decent to achieving proper, like something proper, basically. But it doesn't change the fact that, first of all, that was done on the final day, and given how cold it's been, and we've had F1 cars pounding around Barcelona now for 5 days, I can't believe that the track conditions were not better on Friday versus Thursday, for starters. Mercedes has you don't get any prizes for completing the test a day early, quote unquote early, but it's an extra day they've got to go over the data. And the fact that they were just able to run so trouble-free from the get-go on the Monday, having rolled out on the Monday, after doing the shakedown last week, they've done sort of between a third and half a day of testing more than anyone else, including Ferrari, because of the mileage they've racked up. And the only reason the car seemed to get much quicker on the last day they ran seemed to be because they switched focus from using the C1, the hardest tyre, to the C3 tyre. They've not talked at all about chasing setup or anything like that. And I know most teams will say that, but I think we can just say with reasonable certainty that the Mercedes was just effortlessly reliable and reasonably brisk on the day because of all the effort that went in before. So you compare it to where it is versus McLaren, for example, which is a good reference as a Mercedes engine team, as it's been the world champion for the last couple of years as a team. And Mercedes is clearly ahead of McLaren at the moment on pace, on preparedness and whatnot. As a works team, it's nicely set on what these engines demand, so it'll be a little bit further in its understanding there. It's just across the board. And it means nothing. We could get to the end of Bahrain and what we're saying is very different because Mercedes has had a shocker and Ferrari's come to the fore, or Red Bull's had a mega test or whatever. But right here, right now, even though Ferrari is in a really solid place for where we are in pre-season, it's still not quite as good as where Mercedes is at.
Yeah, so we definitely put Mercedes a step ahead, Ferrari kind of in that group behind. And McLaren there as well, John, defending champions. They didn't get going until Wednesday, which was in line with what Andrea Stella, the team principal, said they'd be doing. But is it taking second billing to the Works Mercedes team?
I think they're behind Mercedes at the moment. But I think what you're seeing at this stage of the season is the preparedness of the Works teams, that this is a whole new rule set. And all this week's been about understanding these regulations. You've got to understand, first of all, how the power units work. How do you deploy the battery? When do you deploy the battery? How do you harvest it? How does a qualifying lap compare to a race lap? How do you sustain the pace over those laps? How does that energy mix in with straight line mode and cornering modes? And then how does that impact? How does partial aero mode impact that? And then what plank ride height do you need to run at if you can't use straight line mode in some sequences of the track? And so many elements need to be understood that there's a massive, massive checklist to run through. And I think the Works teams that have been developing the power units for 2 or 3 years have understood energy deployment and harvesting and simulations and what's needed and how that feeds into car design. I've just had an earlier start in getting to grips with everything than any of the customer teams. And I think that's what we're seeing now, that Mercedes started this test, maybe not necessarily the ultimate quickest car that will be the pace setter by, say, the British Grand Prix or the end of the season. But I just think they're further down the road in understanding it, further down the road in delivering a package right now that is what's needed to be quick at the start of this season. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the other teams can't get the mileage, can't catch up, can't unlock the understanding or steer the design and development of their cars. I think what's going to be key is how quick those kind of knowledge gaps get filled in, basically. Right now, I think Mercedes has taken your knowledge bucket head of these 26 regulations and it's quite full. And I think the others haven't quite got their own knowledge buckets as full up. And the key to this season is how quick they can get those buckets to the brim and then unleash that full potential.
Well, certainly there's been no lack of filling the knowledge buckets for everyone based on this test. And even we've been filling up the knowledge buckets slightly, although it's It's very, very early in its progress bar. But yeah, certainly McLaren, Ferrari, and Mercedes all looking decent. Mercedes and Ferrari first and second in the mileage charts as well. So yeah, all pretty positive. Now, before we continue, as you might know, the Race F1 podcast is part of the Athletic Podcast Network. This time of year, the Athletic runs its annual audience survey. What's in it for me, I hear you ask? Well, if you fill out a quick survey about you and your podcast habits by going to theathletic.com/survey26, you could be one of 3 lucky entries to win £100 or $100 worth of Amazon vouchers. So whether you're a long-time listener or a new one, The Athletic wants your feedback. Go to theathletic.com/survey26. That's theathletic.com/survey26. The link's also in our episode description. Thanks very much. Well, we're still running our 7-day free trial for the Race Members Club, your F1 2026 paddock pass, your chance to spend some more time with us over the year, should that be your want, and also get all of our extra content, video, podcast, ad-free environment, thriving community. Scott, you're very heavily involved in the Race Members Club, both in terms of managing what we do and the generation of the content as well. Are you proud of yourself for your antics? That little clip you mentioned of me and John that I haven't seen but now have.
Did you like it?
Yeah, I thought it was quite good. I was just wondering whether to try and explain what the Betty Hill music is to people, but I think it's probably better just for those who know what it is. You'll know what it is. But yeah, I guess
I would say it is worth signing up for the 7-day free trial alone, just to be able to check out what we're talking about and watch that clip, and then check out some of the other amazing stuff from this week and in the days that are coming up. And I'm pretty sure you'll want to stick around. We did something that was just a little bit silly towards the end of the testing week, which was based on your experiences on site, such that they were. Just to have a little bit of fun, which is one of the best things about the Members Club, is kind of this massive spectrum of stuff that we do, from the more light-hearted and the more kind of, well, none of us have particularly long hair to let down, but to the extent that we can let our hairs down, we do. Right the way to like exclusive like Q&As and personal and professional stories. Bits, for example, when we go to Bahrain, which I don't know about you guys, but after this test and feeding off of scraps, I cannot wait to get to Bahrain. And there, for example, we'll be doing, In-Car Insights, which is our really, really popular in-car podcast that we do, snap recordings from, videos back to the Members Club, basically just like, I've just finished watching testing trackside, this is what I've learned, stuff like that. So, yeah, it's there's a wide variety, and it's never more varied, fun, spontaneous, and chaotic as during testing.
Exactly, yeah. And it's not all time lapses of me and John standing up a mountain, pointing.
Don't give it away.
Doing a lot of pointing. Well, I wanted to give people some idea of what they're going to see, but yeah, it's great fun. The engagement level is the best thing. It's such a great place for so many like-minded people. So try out the 7-day free trial to find out what it's all about. You can follow us through the whole year, loads of extra content. The link is in the episode description, or head to Patreon, search for the race or the Race Members Club, and you'll be able to find out more. Okay, Scott, there's one big team we haven't talked about, Red Bull, who ultimately seemed to have a reasonable test, but not entirely untroubled. Yes,
so I think there are 2 elements to it, which is when we talk about the Red Bull test from the team side, and then obviously the engine side. So the engine side was very positive overall. I'm sure we're going to get into that in a little bit more detail. But for team specifically, it was just middling, really. There were elements of it that were really good. The car seemed to run really well on day one. It was doing perfectly fine. A little bit of lost track time on day 2 on Tuesday. Then Isaac Hadjar had that crash. And they didn't lose any major track time as a result. That came late in the day. They still had only 1 day left to use, so it didn't matter that they had to wait until Friday and get some spares out and rebuild the car. It was a big effort, but they were able to do it. And Verstappen had a good full day in the car on Friday, over 100 laps, 118, I think, certainly pushing 120. Car's about a second off the pace. Who cares in Barcelona? As long as that's not the maximum the Red Bull can do, it's irrelevant. But it wasn't as good as Mercedes' test or Ferrari's test. And you talk to anybody from any team, you read any of the stuff that they said on the record, what they've said, what they tell us off the record, whatever. The 2 things any team wants from this test is good reliability and to start understanding their car. Now, those two things go hand in hand, but the reliability is also about making sure things work, systems are all okay, blah, blah, blah. The simple fact is, by not doing as many laps as other teams, you do not have as good reliability. You have not validated your car and your systems as well as others. You have not started to understand, what your car is capable of over long runs, this kind of stuff. Like I said earlier, if you're talking about Mercedes versus Ferrari and having a third of the day more testing, that gives Mercedes an advantage. But if Mercedes has the equivalent of a day more testing than another team, that's a colossal advantage at this stage of the season. And simply put, Red Bull and McLaren as well didn't do as much running this week as they would have wanted.
Yeah, to put some numbers on that, Mercedes did 500 laps across the test. Of course, you can run on 3 of the 5 days. Red Bull did 303 laps. So that is quite a big difference. Similar number to what Racing Bulls.
1.5 days.
Exactly, yeah. Similar to what Racing Bulls managed. They managed 319 laps. Of course, they're both running the Red Bull powertrains engine. And I guess, John, that's the positive story about Red Bull, isn't it? The powertrains product seems to be, I mean, we can at least say it's decent, isn't it? And probably more than decent.
Yeah, they're not as quick and ready as Mercedes. But I think if you'd have asked anybody 12 months ago, give us an outline of how the first test in Barcelona will go for Red Bull and its two teams, it wouldn't have been the picture of this week. I think you would have found more people saying, "Oh, they'll be slow. There'll be reliability problems. There'll be talks of crisis. There'll be the first whispers that Max Verstappen wants to leave. All this sort of thing." And we've had none of that. It's been solid enough to be impressive just by the fact that there's been very few dramas. There weren't any blow-ups. One team told me today their analysis of the power units is actually what many thought would be a big differentiator at this stage of the season. Actually, there seems to be very little performance in them. But that comes with a caveat in terms of we don't know who's turned things up a bit more so far and how much people are leaning on the engines. But right now, you've got to say Red Bull are in the ballpark. I think that gaggle behind Mercedes, I think we can say Mercedes are in front as of now. It could all change by the Bahrain test. But as we sit here post-Barcelona, you've got to say Mercedes holds the advantage. Then there's that gaggle behind that we haven't really got a clear picture of. Ferrari, McLaren, Red Bull. But I think as we go through the next 2 tests, that kind of we'll be able to shake those out a little bit to get more direction. But I think you'll want to see, if Red Bull want to be winning races from near the start of the season, they're going to have to just turn things up a little bit over the Bahrain tests.
I think in the context of Red Bull Ford powertrain story, I think you have to look at Audi as a really good reference for what Red Bull's achieved as a new in-house engine company and engine manufacturer, because they are up against a works team that outlined its engine commitment to F1 in the late summer of 2022. So Audi have had a very, very good lead time on this, that we've talked a lot about what they have and haven't maximised on the car side, the team side in terms of the growth in that time, but the engine runway hasn't really been compromised by the way that they mapped things out. So that, and we know what Audi's track record and pedigree is as a motorsport manufacturer, not in F1, right? Now, Red Bull's company is a specialist independent F1 engine company. They've recruited from all over the place. Then it's not just a bunch of random people who have never built an F1 engine before or anything like that. But the Red Bull engine versus the Audi engine it's almost night and day different in terms of how it's performed this week. Like performance, not in a literal sense, but in terms of how well it's run. Because Audi had a red flag on its first day, a red flag on its second day, and on its third day, it lost a chunk of time in the morning. Now, it did run really well over the rest of that third day, so great recovery from Audi there, not knocking them for that. But it shows how hard it is, and I really don't think you can kind of overstate how impressive it is that Red Bull has done that as an engine company straight away.
Yeah, and actually mention of the power unit side, this test does highlight the disadvantage of only having one power unit out there, because obviously the number of laps completed by engine manufacturer. It goes in number of supplies order. So you've got Mercedes with 1,136 laps, Ferrari with 3 teams, 992 laps, Red Bull Powertrains 2 teams, 622 laps. Then you've got Audi sat there on 240 laps and Honda on just 65. So that's a big difference in terms of the amount of data accumulated.
Am I forgetting a team here, or isn't the Mercedes one made up of 3 teams at this test because Williams isn't here?
Yeah, I've generously counted Williams there, who contributed precisely naught. Didn't even contribute the miles of getting there with the actual car itself. So yeah,
so
you're absolutely
my
right.
point, but my point is, like, you see when you've got, even if you've only got 3 teams instead of 4 versus Audi having 1. Like, I was really impressed with because the Red Bull mileage, for example, is basically where it should be for the number of teams it has versus the others. It's pretty strong. Especially for a new manufacturer. But the thing is, the more teams you have, just the more, even if one has a problem, just you have extra chances for a team to just punch in a massive number of laps each day. I mean, Haas did nearly 200 laps on the final day, and Ferrari's not been short of running on its own. But it was an amazing final day of running for Ferrari. Really, really good, especially because one of its teams is Cadillac, the new team, which obviously hasn't had a huge amount of running this week. So, yeah, I just think you're looking at it from a learning perspective, right? And this isn't knocking Audi properly or anything like that, but it's just, it's especially because Audi set itself up to be able to maximize mileage on this test, early sign up of the car and the engine spec for this and blah, blah, blah. And it hasn't had a smooth test. That might have been expected. That's fine, but it has not been as good as what others have achieved.
Yeah, it's fair to say on Audi, John, a few problems. They caused at least 2 red flags, didn't they? Bortoletto had one on the first day, and then there was Hulkenberg later on, had a hydraulic leak. That was a relatively regulation problem, I think. They weren't too concerned about that. But a lot of work to be done, I think, at Audi.
Yeah, I think Mattia Bonotto, the chief project leader, talked about a very long list, the longest list he thinks he's ever seen in Formula One in terms of jobs to do before they get to Bahrain. But it is we say it's a new manufacturer, then Red Bull are a new manufacturer, and Red Bull this is Red Bull's first ever racing engine. I think this is what makes that project so impressive. And it hasn't got the might of a car manufacturer behind it. Maybe it'll reshape the way F1 engines are done in the future, that maybe you need bespoke, lean, mean fighting machines to produce best power units for regulations. But in terms of Audi, they're playing catch up. They're playing catch up in understanding regulations. They're playing catch up in moulding an engine manufacturer with a team. So there's a long, long, long way to go for them. But just like with Aston Martin in some respects, the commitment's there to get there. It's just a question of, when can it start making the progress? But I think they're under no illusions. They're not expecting to rock up in Melbourne and be fighting at the front.
One thing is worth raising on engines very quickly while we're talking about this. Now, I don't know if either of you two have any knowledge on this that you can drop on this podcast right now. I certainly don't know what people have been running. But the one question mark I have over engine performance and reliability for this test is we do know that teams were given permission to run non-homologated fuel at this test. And there is just a bit of a question mark in my mind of, because they wouldn't have done that. My point has always been they wouldn't have done that if someone hadn't asked for it or said that they needed to or whatever, right? So who is it? And is it more than one? Is it all of them? I don't know. And how big an impact will that have? Because I know, speaking to a few people towards the end of last year, they were really talking up the fuel as a big unknown in terms of not just performance, but reliability. So really curious to see what we can learn about that over the next couple of weeks and if that makes a difference. I just wanted to chuck that in because I do think it is a caveat worth including.
Yeah, and there's nothing in the knowledge bucket about that at this stage. That's something hopefully we'll find out a little bit in Bahrain, but it's just an extra confounding fact. Now, Cadillac, slowest of the teams, didn't complete a huge amount of mileage. I mean, just 164 laps done by the Cadillac. But I think, Scott, that's fine for Cadillac given what they are as a brand new team.
Yeah, the mileage was a little bit lower than I expected or hoped for, but actually performance-wise, massive caveat attached to this, obviously, I actually was about where I sort of thought it would be. Sort of 4.5 seconds off, I think, by the end of the test, with Bottas's best time on the final day.
Yeah, he did a 1 minute 20.920, and the fastest time was Lewis Hamilton's 16.348.
Yeah, so honestly, I don't want to stress the point too much, because we've said it on other podcasts as well. Like, I don't have huge expectations for Cadillac, because I think it has an enormous task ahead of it for this season in particular. And I think it will be at the back. I think it will be. I don't think it will necessarily be massively adrift, but I do think it will have the slowest car. And I wouldn't be surprised if there's a 2.5 second field spread anyway across the other 10 teams, and then maybe Cadillac's a few tenths off that, a second off that, whatever. So I would say if Cadillac can be about 3 seconds off the ultimate pace, that's about where I'm sort of thinking it'll be. So for the first test, 4.5 seconds is about where I thought it was. I would have been worried if it had remained 6 seconds off the pace or whatever through the test, but where it's ended up isn't a million miles away from where I think it will be in the season itself.
Yeah, I think hats off to everyone at Cadillac. It is an awesome challenge to build up a new F1 team from scratch today with the size of teams. And yeah, I think that they've done all that can be expected of them at this stage. So well done. Alpine, John, the quickest for what lap times are worth, which is not a great deal in isolation. Alpine was the quickest. Pierre Gasly's 1:17.707 of the recognised midfield group. So that's pretty good for Alpine, isn't it?
I think they'll be satisfied with this week, but I don't think it was a week where we saw that the performance of that car and engine package. I mean, it looked solid. If you've got what looks to be the best engine in the back of your car, Enstone's a well-oiled machine. They've spent an entire year preparing to build a car for the 26 regulations. So I think they've ticked all the boxes they wanted to do. They've got some understanding, but we haven't seen the potential of that car. I think they're a team that you could be placed as in that. They could be in that gaggle behind Mercedes. They could be kind of leading the C group behind that Ferrari, McLaren, Red Bull area. We don't particularly know at the moment. And I think, as Steve Nielsen, their managing director, said, until you get to Bahrain and you start seeing the long runs and you can start properly working out fuel loads and pace and calculating where people are stacking up, then I don't think we'll get much of an indication of how that midfield is shaping up.
They were one of the teams that had a big final day, an important final day. I think Gasly did 164 laps on Friday, which was much needed. He had the slightest air of frustration when he'd spoken earlier in the week about the lack of, or the mileage that had been completed up to that point, shall we say. So I think he and Alpine got exactly what they needed out of Friday. It put them back into an area of good respectability for the test overall, given it's first test using a Mercedes engine for however many years now, and it's a brand new engine working with everything. We know that deal was put together relatively late in engine terms, so it's not as going to be as an optimized a package as any of the other customer teams should be. So yeah, a better final day.
And probably, Scott, we can cut and paste some of that for Haas. Not the engine change, but midfield team, got a lot of mileage in. First and third day for them of their running was good. The second day was a little bit compromised by some little issues, but pretty good for Haas, pretty good on pace. Don't know where they are, but they look fine, don't they?
Yeah, about where I thought Haas would be, really, which is doing a load of laps, running a really diligent test program. That's been the way since Komatsu took charge as team principal. Big emphasis on laps there for the last two pre-seasons. Didn't think it would be any different this year. Recovered well from that setback on their second day of running, which did limit them on the day quite a lot. But again, that is something that I wasn't surprised by, because it's not a team where I think it's going to be bulletproof all the way through testing, but it's also a team that I would back to sort it fairly quickly, especially as the issues seem to be on Haas's side rather than a Ferrari engine problem that suddenly set alarm bells ringing or anything like that. So nice and productive. I think the drivers seemed quite happy with where they were, especially I would imagine Ocon's happier at the end of the test, having got the chance to kind of see where the car had got to by the end versus what it was like on that opening day. So he kind of got a really good reference for what progress was made. And yeah, Komatsu seemed quite pleased with operationally the progress over the week, but also what they had learned and ticked off with the car, and just that classic testing thing of you address issues and that makes the car go faster without trying to make the car go faster. So a solid enough position in the midfield. But I've said this on previous podcasts, it's the smallest design team, including Cadillac as well. It should be at the back. It's just how competitive it can be in the midfield.
Yeah, but certainly Haas, Alpine, I'd say Racing Bulls are the kind of three relatively content midfield teams, because they were 3rd, 4th and 5th in the mileage charts, which is important. John, how impressed were you with Williams?
I didn't see them put a foot wrong all week, actually. Impeccable, didn't cause any red flags. Smooth.
Excellent. We'll say a little bit more about Williams when they turn up for Bahrain, and we talked about them on the previous edition of this podcast. So hopefully that whistle-stop tour of what we've learned from testing has informed people. Like I say, we've been doing it without a lot of the stuff we normally do in testing in terms of trackside observations, this kind of thing, and being able to do a little bit more speaking directly to drivers to understand what's going on. We'll do all of that in the 2 Bahrain tests that are coming up. Me, John and Scott will all be heading to Bahrain at various times, so we're looking forward to that. But so far, it's looking quite good for Mercedes. So that's the story from the Barcelona test. We've got lots more to come, including a tech overview, a podcast with Gary Anderson and Mark Hughes looking at the details of the cars now that we've had a good look at pretty much all of them. That's coming up next, and then we'll be on to Bahrain. So stay with us for everything you need to know from the world of Formula One.